The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon when I stumbled out onto my porch, barefoot and groggy, only to discover that my mailbox was gone. Not vandalized, not damaged, just completely vanished, as if some rogue band of mailbox thieves had spirited it away in the night. I stood there staring at the empty patch of dirt where it had once stood proud and functional, a strange mix of confusion and dread washing over me until a single unshakable realization hit. This wasn't some random prank. It had HOA Karen written all over it. I should have known this neighborhood was trouble the moment I moved in. Everything was too perfect. Identical houses, manicured lawns, and a Stepford-like vibe that clung to the residents like a second skin. Within a day of unloading my moving boxes, I met Karen, the self-appointed dictator of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, a woman in her late 50s with a helmet of immovable blonde hair, a clipboard perpetually in hand, and a sour expression that suggested she'd smelled something rotten the second she saw me. "Welcome to Willow Creek," she'd said, her voice dripping with the saccharine sweetness of someone who'd perfected passive-aggressive warfare. "I do hope you'll respect our community guidelines. We take uniformity very seriously here." I'd nodded politely, not thinking much of it then, but that was before the first violation notice arrived in my mailbox just 3 days later, citing my perfectly fine, government-issued mailbox as non-compliant with HOA aesthetic standards. Apparently, it wasn't up to Willow Creek's snobbish code. Karen didn't just suggest I replace it. She demanded I shell out $600 for an HOA-approved model, a price so absurd I couldn't believe she'd typed it with a straight face. I wasn't about to waste that kind of money to appease some neighborhood tyrant's obsession with symmetry, so I did what any reasonable person would. I dug into the legal codes and confirmed my suspicions. My mailbox was federally owned property, beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. Armed with this knowledge, I fired off a polite but firm email to Karen, citing the relevant federal laws and assuming that be the end of it. Oh, how naive I was. The very next morning, my mailbox was gone, no warning, no further notices, just an empty hole in the ground where it used to be. And as I stood there, my blood boiling, Karen had the gall to march up my driveway, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. "Good morning, Jake," she chirped, feigning pleasantness. "I see you've noticed the correction to your non-compliant mailbox." I crossed my arms, glaring at her. "You mean theft because someone stole my mailbox?" She chuckled, that condescending HOA tyrant chuckle, and waved a hand dismissively. "Oh dear, that's such a dramatic way to put it. The HOA had to repossess your non-compliant mailbox. You were given ample opportunity to correct the violation." I stared at her, incredulous. "You repossessed federal property? Are you insane? You can't just take a mailbox." Karen's smirk didn't waver. If anything, she looked pleased with herself, as she replied, "As per Willow Creek HOA regulations, all exterior fixtures must align with community standards. I'm sure you'll be happy to know you can pick up an approved replacement at my house, for a reasonable fine, of course." My hands curled into fists. "You're charging me a fine for a mailbox you stole." She waved me off again. "Don't be so dramatic. We're simply maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood." I took a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Karen, do you have any idea how illegal this is? That's federal property. There are actual laws against tampering with mailboxes." Her smirk held firm. "Then by all means, take it up with the HOA board, but I wouldn't waste my time if I were you. The board always supports my decisions. It's best if you just comply and save yourself the trouble." Karen's smug dismissal lit a fire in me that I hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just wrong, she was power-drunk. The kind of person who'd never faced real consequences and thought she was untouchable, but she'd underestimated me, and that was her fatal mistake. I didn't waste another breath arguing with her or chasing the HOA board's approval. I turned on my heel, marched inside, and ignored her parting shot about being reasonable as I slammed the door behind me. I had bigger plans, and they started with the federal government. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local post office first, explaining the situation to a gruff-sounding man who let out a low whistle when I finished. "She took your mailbox." "Man, that's a serious offense. You might want to escalate this." "Oh, I plan to," I assured him, already pulling up the contact info for the Postal Inspection Service, the federal agency tasked with handling crimes against the mail system, because if Karen wanted war, I was bringing the cavalry. I spent the next hour crafting a detailed complaint, attaching my email exchange with Karen, photos of the empty dirt patch where my mailbox once stood, and the piece de resistance. Security camera footage of Karen and her HOA goons yanking the mailbox out of the ground like a pack of petty thieves. By the time I hit submit, adrenaline was surging through me. Karen thought she'd won, thought she could flex her little fiefdom's power without pushback. But she just committed a federal crime, and the Postmaster General doesn't mess around when it comes to their turf. The response came faster than I dared hope. Less than 24 hours later, my phone rang, and a sharp, no-nonsense voice introduced itself as Richard Malone, a postal inspector who'd clearly seen his share of bureaucratic nonsense and wasn't fazed by it. He listened to my story, asked for every scrap of evidence I had, the emails, the violation notice, the footage, and I sent it all over within minutes, barely containing my grin as I hit send. An hour later, Malone called back, clearing his throat before delivering the news. "Well, Mr. Carter, your HOA president is in for one hell of a surprise." I could hear the amusement in his tone, and it made my day. He explained that tampering with a mailbox violated Title 18, Section 1705 of the U.S. Code, a federal crime carrying hefty fines and potential jail time, and the Postal Service took it very, very seriously. "So what happens now?" I asked, leaning back in my chair, a wave of satisfaction washing over me for the first time since this mess started. Malone chuckled. "Now we pay your HOA a little visit." The next morning, I was on my porch sipping coffee when a black sedan rolled into the neighborhood. Out stepped Malone, crisp suit and badge gleaming, flanked by two uniformed postal inspectors, their faces stone cold as they headed straight for Karen's house, and I knew she had no idea what was coming. Karen was outside, pruning her pristine rose bushes when she spotted them. Her smile faltered as Malone flashed his badge and asked, "Mrs. Whitmore?" She straightened, slipping back into her self-important mask. "That's me. How can I help you, gentlemen?" Malone didn't waste a second, pulling out a folder with the evidence I'd sent and laying it out. "We're with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, here regarding a report of federal mailbox tampering and theft. We've got video and documentation showing you and the Willow Creek HOA illegally removed a federally protected mailbox." Karen's face turned a spectacular shade of red, her lips pressing into a thin line as she sputtered. "Now hold on, that mailbox violated HOA regulations. We had every right to remove it." Malone didn't blink. "No, ma'am, you didn't. Mailboxes are government property once installed, and you have zero authority to touch them." Karen's bravado crumbled right there in her manicured front yard, her usual air of control slipping as Malone's words sank in. Federal law didn't bend for HOA rules, and she just crashed headfirst into that reality. She blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water before she managed to sputter. "Well, I wasn't aware of that." Malone's steel gaze didn't soften. "Ignorance of the law isn't a defense, ma'am." For the first time since I'd moved to Willow Creek, I saw Karen lose her grip. She scrambled for a way out, but there was no HOA policy, no fine print, no passive-aggressive email that could save her now. The law was the law, and she was caught. One of the uniformed inspectors stepped forward, his tone flat and official. "We're issuing you a formal citation, Mrs. Whitmore. You're being fined for unlawful mailbox tampering. The final penalty will be determined after review by the Postmaster General's office." Karen let out a disbelieving laugh, her composure cracking further. "A citation? This is ridiculous. You're treating me like some criminal." Malone didn't flinch. "Because, ma'am, you committed a crime." Her hands clenched at her sides as a few neighbors began to gather, drawn by the spectacle. Some whispered, others smirked, and it was clear not everyone in Willow Creek worshipped their HOA queen as much as she thought. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted, forcing a stiff smile. "I'm sure we can resolve this internally." Malone shook his head. "No, ma'am, this is a federal matter now." Her arguments about community guidelines, how it wasn't a big deal, how the HOA should override federal law fell flat. The inspector stayed stone-faced, writing up the report as she floundered, her rein visibly unraveling. By the time Malone and his team left, Karen's smug facade was gone. She was no longer the untouchable tyrant, just a woman realizing she'd made a colossal mistake, and I couldn't have been happier watching it unfold from my porch. As soon as they were out of sight, she stormed over to me, her eyes blazing. "You think you've won?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, smiling calmly. "I don't think I've won, I know I have." Her glare sharpened. "You don't belong here, you don't fit in." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Funny, I was thinking the same about you." For once, she had no retort. She spun around, lips pursed so tight they vanished, and marched back to her house, her defeat palpable. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Karen might have gotten a citation, but that wouldn't break her. She was too stubborn, too arrogant to back down without a bigger hit, and I knew exactly where to aim: her power, her control, and her wallet. I decided to escalate further, reaching out to the HOA board, not to grovel, but to turn the tide against her. She'd ruled Willow Creek like a dictator for too long, and this was her first real vulnerability. The fallout spread fast. Within a day, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and smirks. Karen's loyalists tried to downplay it as an overreaction, but most residents were thrilled. For years, she'd buried them under petty violations and fines, and now she was the one in the crosshairs. No rallying cry from me was needed. They'd been waiting for this. Overnight, a petition circulated, demanding an emergency HOA vote to oust her as president. It was poetic justice, her own rules twisting to choke her. And by the time the meeting was called, the turnout was unprecedented, people showing up just to see her squirm. The emergency HOA meeting felt like a reckoning. The community center packed with residents who'd never bothered to show up before, all eager to witness Karen's downfall firsthand. She sat at the head of the long conference table, her usual power blazer clinging to her like armor, but the confidence that once oozed from her was nowhere to be found, replaced by a brittle stiffness that betrayed how much she knew was at stake. The petition to remove her had gathered more signatures than anyone expected, and as the meeting kicked off with mundane formalities, the tension in the room was electric. No one cared about the usual nonsense. Everyone was there for the vote. Karen tried to defend herself, her voice tight as she justified the mailbox repossession as a noble act of community preservation, but her words landed on deaf ears. Blank stares and stifled laughs met every excuse, her credibility torched by that federal citation. When the vote finally came, it was a slaughter. 5-1, with only her diehard loyalist Linda casting a shaky ballot in her favor. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as the result sank in, and just like that, Karen Whitmore was no longer HOA president. She sat frozen for a long moment, as if her brain couldn't process the impossible. She'd ruled Willow Creek for years, bending it to her will, and now she was nothing. When she finally stood, her jaw tight and fists clenched, she grabbed her leather folder and stormed toward the exit, brushing past the handful of people who parted for her without a word. She didn't glance my way, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel the fury radiating off her. She wasn't just angry, she was humiliated, and I savored every second of it from my seat in the back. A few days later, the official blow landed. An envelope from the Postmaster General's office arrived, detailing Karen's fate. A $10,000 fine for mailbox tampering, a sum that wasn't just a slap on the wrist but a public branding of her failure, stripping away the illusion of power she'd clung to so fiercely. But the real kicker came next, because she'd orchestrated the removal of multiple mailboxes in the neighborhood, not just mine. She was on the hook to replace them all at her own expense, a penalty that turned her petty crusade into a financial gut punch. Word spread like wildfire, and the neighbors she'd terrorized for years flipped the script. Someone taped a printout of federal mailbox laws to her doorstep. Another set up a mailbox appreciation display with a plaque reading, "Protected by the U.S. government, unlike Karen." And the passive-aggressive mockery she once wielded was now a weapon against her. The day she had to install the replacements was pure theater. Residents lingered outside, coffee in hand, watching as Karen and a hired handyman grudgingly set up the new mailboxes, her face locked in a scowl as she avoided eye contact. One by one, the stolen boxes were restored, including mine, but I couldn't resist a twist. I'd ordered a new one, gold-plated, oversized, and gloriously excessive, delivered just in time for her to see it. She muttered, "You can't be serious," as I strolled up to inspect it, and I shrugged. "What? It meets all federal and HOA regulations." Her eyes twitched, but she had no comeback. Her defeat was absolute, and by week's end, the moving truck confirmed it. Karen was leaving Willow Creek, her reign over, her control shattered, and I couldn't have scripted a better ending. Karen's departure from Willow Creek didn't come with fanfare. No grand goodbye, no final HOA decree. Just the quiet rumble of a moving truck pulling up to her house. A sight that felt like a victory lap for everyone she'd lorded over. Maybe she'd been planning to leave all along, or maybe the humiliation of losing her presidency and footing the bill for her mailbox fiasco was too much to bear in a neighborhood that no longer bent to her will. Either way, she was gone, and the day she left, I found an envelope taped to my shiny new gold-plated mailbox. No return address, no name, just a single note inside in her prim, overly formal handwriting. "This neighborhood was better before you." I laughed out loud, her last petty jab a perfect capstone to her downfall, and tucked it into my pocket as I watched her car vanish down the street. For the first time since moving in, Willow Creek felt like home. The dictatorship was dead, and the neighborhood exhaled. Lawns stayed neat but not obsessively so, and the oppressive uniformity Karen had enforced began to loosen, replaced by a tentative freedom among residents who'd chafed under her rule for years. My mailbox stood as a gleaming monument to the whole saga, its ostentatious gold catching the sunlight and drawing amused nods from neighbors who'd once been too afraid to cross her. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a symbol, a middle finger to the tyranny of HOA busybodies everywhere. The story of Karen's collapse spread beyond Willow Creek. Too, friends I told couldn't believe the audacity of her theft or the swiftness of the federal smackdown, and I'd catch myself grinning every time I recounted how she'd underestimated me right up until the Postal Service rolled in. Looking back, it wasn't just about the mailbox. It was about standing up to someone who thrived on control, who thought rules were her personal plaything to wield against anyone who didn't fit her mold. I'd moved into Willow Creek expecting a quiet life, not a showdown with a clipboard-wielding despot, but Karen had turned it into a battle, and I'd won by refusing to play her game. Instead, I'd gone over her head, straight to the feds, and watched her house of cards topple. The $10,000 fine and the mailbox replacements were the legal consequences, but the real punishment was the loss of her power. She'd built her identity on it, and without it, she couldn't stay. That note she left was proof she knew it, too, a bitter little whimper from someone who'd finally met her match. I didn't gloat, not outwardly anyway, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a surge of pride every time I passed that golden mailbox or caught a neighbor's knowing smirk. We'd all been liberated, and it started with me saying no to her nonsense. The HOA board, now led by a quieter, less tyrannical president, dialed back the petty enforcement, and Willow Creek settled into something closer to normalcy. No more violation notices for minor infractions, no more Karen lurking with her clipboard. Life moved on, but the legend of the mailbox war lingered, a cautionary tale for any would-be neighborhood overlords, and I settled into my new routine, content that I'd not only kept my ground but turned the tables so thoroughly she'd had no choice but to leave. With Karen gone, Willow Creek didn't just breathe easier, it transformed, shedding the suffocating grip of her reign like a snake slewing off dead skin. The change wasn't loud or dramatic, but you could feel it in the air, a lightness that hadn't existed before. Neighbors who'd kept their heads down started chatting over fences, lawns sprouted the occasional quirky decoration, and the HOA meetings, once Karen's personal stage for issuing edicts, turned into sleepy, uneventful gatherings where the new president, a mild-mannered guy named Tom, focused on practical stuff like pothole repairs instead of policing mailbox aesthetics. My gold-plated monstrosity stood tall, a daily reminder of the chaos that had unfolded, and I'd catch people grinning at it as they passed. Some even stopped to say they wished they'd stood up to her sooner, turning me into an accidental folk hero of sorts. The ripple effects of Karen's fall went beyond the neighborhood, too. I'd started digging into HOA horror stories online, and Willow Creek's mailbox saga fit right in with tales of power-tripping busybodies everywhere. It was oddly validating to know I wasn't alone in facing down petty tyrants, and sharing my story with a few forums earned me a slew of virtual high-fives. Back home, the physical evidence of her defeat lingered. Those replacement mailboxes she'd been forced to install dotted the street, each one a quiet jab at her hubris, and I'd smirk every time I saw them, knowing she'd paid out of pocket for every single one. The $10,000 fine had been the legal hammer, but making her undo her own mess. That was the kind of poetic justice that kept me warm at night. I couldn't help but replay the whole thing in my head sometimes. How it started with her smug correction of my mailbox, how she'd strutted up my driveway thinking she'd won, and how fast it all unraveled when the postal service showed up. She'd underestimated me, sure, but she'd also underestimated the system she'd poked, and that was her real undoing. I'd never set out to dismantle her empire. I just wanted my damn mailbox back. But once she'd escalated it, I'd had no choice but to fight and fight dirty. Going federal wasn't just a win for me. It was a warning shot to every HOA dictator out there. Mess with the mail and you're playing with fire. Corinne's note, that final sour grape, sat on my kitchen counter for a while, a trophy of her concession, until I tossed it in the trash. She didn't deserve any more space in my life. The neighborhood wasn't perfect without her. There were still squabbles, still rules. But the air of fear she'd cultivated was gone, replaced by a cautious camaraderie that felt earned. I'd settled into a routine, walking past my gaudy mailbox each morning with a quiet nod to the absurdity of it all. People moved on, but the story stuck. New residents would hear whispers of the mailbox guy and the woman who'd fled after crossing the feds, and I'd just shrug when they asked, letting the legend grow on its own. Willow Creek had become mine in a way I hadn't expected, not because I'd conquered it, but because I'd outlasted the one who thought she owned it, and that was more than enough for me. Life in Willow Creek after Corinne felt like waking up from a long, bizarre dream, the kind where you're trapped under someone's thumb until you finally break free, and suddenly the world makes sense again. The neighborhood didn't turn into some utopian paradise overnight, but the absence of her clipboard tyranny left room for something human to grow. People waved more, kids played louder, and the HOA's once-dreaded violation notices became rare, reserved for actual problems like overgrown trees blocking the road instead of nitpicking paint shades. Tom, the new president, wasn't perfect, but he didn't strut around like he owned our souls, and that alone was a win. My gold-plated mailbox, still gleaming like a tacky beacon, had become a local landmark. Neighbors jokingly called it the monument, and I'd catch them snapping pics with it, turning my petty rebellion into a shared badge of honor. The memory of Corinne's collapse stuck with me, though, not out of spite, but as a lesson in how far someone can fall when they build their castle on sand. She'd ruled through fear and petty power, but the second real authority stepped in, her whole act crumbled, and I'd been the one to pull the thread. I'd never forget Malone and his team rolling up, badges out, her face going from smug to scarlet as they laid out the law. She'd thought she was above it all. But the feds didn't care about her HOA bylaws or her pristine rose bushes. That $10,000 fine and the mailbox replacements were just the start. The real damage was to her ego, and having to slink away from Willow Creek, tail between her legs, was the kind of defeat she couldn't spin. Her note to me proved she knew it, even if she'd never admit it out loud. I started wondering about the bigger picture after that. How many Corinnes were out there, terrorizing subdivisions with their little kingdoms, and how many people just rolled over because it was easier? I'd stumbled into this fight by accident, but winning it made me realize there's power in pushing back, especially when you've got the law on your side. The Postal Service had been my ace, but it could have been anything: city codes, property rights, anything to remind these petty dictators they're not invincible. Willow Creek's liberation wasn't just my story anymore. It was ours. A quiet uprising sparked by one stolen mailbox, and every time someone thanked me or flashed a knowing grin, I felt the weight of that shift, a community reclaiming itself from the grip of one woman's delusions. By now, the saga had settled into lore. Newcomers heard it from old-timers, embellished with each retelling. The crazy HOA lady who stole mailboxes, the guy who called in the feds, the gold-plated triumph that sent her packing. I didn't mind the myth-making; it kept the spirit alive, a warning to anyone tempted to pick up where Corinne left off. And as winter rolled in, I'd stand by my mailbox, coffee in hand, watching the street hum with a peace she'd never allowed. It wasn't about me being a hero. It was about proving you don't have to bow to bullies, even ones with clipboards, and that felt like a legacy worth leaving behind. Winter settled over Willow Creek like a soft blanket, mooting the neighborhood's edges and casting my gold-plated mailbox in a frosty glow. It stood there, unyielding, a glitzy sentinel of the chaos that had redefined this place, and I couldn't help but smile every time I saw it. Karen was a ghost now, her house sold to a young couple who waved instead of scowling, and the HOA had shrunk back to what it should have been. A dull group handling dues and streetlights, not a regime dictating lives. Tom kept things steady, and the residents, freed from her shadow, started living a little louder, a little messier, a little more like themselves. The mailbox war, as folks now called it, had become the stuff of legend. Newcomers heard it over backyard beers. Kids turned it into a game of Karen versus the mailman. And I'd just nod when asked, letting the story grow wilder with each telling, because the truth was wild enough. I'd never planned to be the guy who took down an HOA tyrant. Hell, I just wanted to unpack my boxes and live quietly. But Karen had forced my hand, and winning that fight taught me something about myself. I wasn't the type to bend for no reason, not when I knew I was right. The feds had been my weapon, sure, but it was the principle that drove me. Her smug theft, her assumption I'd roll over, her whole warped belief she could rewrite reality with a clipboard. Malone and his team had brought the hammer, but I'd handed them the nails, and watching her crumble under that weight was a satisfaction I'd carry forever. That $10,000 fine, those replacement mailboxes, her humiliated exit, they weren't just punishment. They were proof that power like hers only lasts until someone calls its bluff. The neighborhood didn't owe me anything. I didn't need thanks or plaques, but the quiet nods from people who'd suffered her reign said enough. They'd reclaimed their little slice of suburbia, and I'd helped light the match. I started thinking about the Karens still out there, lurking in other cul-de-sacs, and wondered how many mailboxes it'd take to topple them all. Not that I was itching for another round, but the idea of petty tyrants everywhere sweating over federal law made me grin. Willow Creek was my win, but it felt bigger, like a ripple that might nudge others to stand up too. The gold mailbox stayed, less a trophy now and more a promise, to myself, to this place, that I'd never let someone like her dictate what home meant again. As spring crept in, I found myself at peace, the saga fatting into a story I'd tell over coffee or a beer, always ending with that note she left. This neighborhood was better before you. Maybe it was for her, but for the rest of us it was better now, messier, freer hours, and I'd trade her sterile perfection for that any day. I'd watch the sun hit that ridiculous mailbox, catch a neighbor's laugh on the breeze, and know I'd done more than save a piece of metal. I'd helped bury a dictatorship, and Willow Creek was all the richer for it. The war was over, the tyrant was gone, and my mailbox, it had never looked better.